Hello and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We're honored to have with us today Pat Williams. A proud native of Butte, Pat attended the University of Montana, William Jewell College, and the University of Denver. In the 1960s, he served 2 terms in the state legislature, and beginning in 1978, Pat was elected by the people of Montana to an unprecedented 9 consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. During that 18-year tenure, he served as Deputy Whip and Chairman of the Post-Secondary Education Committee. Since his retirement from Congress in 1997, he has been Senior Fellow and Regional Policy Associate at the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West and has taught classes at the University of Montana. He is one of the founders of the 8-state progressive policy group called Western Progress, for whom he is the Director of Northern States Operations. Like one of our previous guests, Joe McDonald, Pat was named in the year 2000 to the Missoulian's list of the 100 most influential Montanans of the 20th century. I should mention at the outset here that Pat has been generous enough with his time to record 2 half-hour programs with us. This first half hour will run just before the Montana Democratic primary on June 3rd. And in this program, we will have the chance to discuss politics and partisan issues, including the epic contest between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. The second program will air the following week, just after the primary, and in that program we will explore issues in progressivism in a nonpartisan way, including Pat's work with the nonpartisan group Western Progress. Welcome, Pat.
Thanks Tom, thank you. It's nice to see you.
Well, it's great to have you with us. Before we get to the issue on everyone's minds, Barack and Hillary, let me ask you to articulate for our viewers why any of this stuff matters. So we still have a lot of people who don't vote, and make the case for us of what difference does it make?
Well, it makes a big difference. I mean, everything we know about American government tells us that it works. Sometimes not as well as it should. Lately, probably not as well as it should, but it does work. I mean, people wanted Social Security, and they voted for those candidates that said they would create it, and we got it. People wanted an interstate highway system. Some candidates were for it, some were opposed to it. Candidates were for it, won, we got it. And the list goes on and on and on. Government can make a positive difference in individual lives. But if we're going to get what we want, we have to rally around the people that we think will provide those special needs that we have. And so I think turnout in voting is very important. Let me say something else about your, within your question. You said a lot of people don't vote. And boy, is that true. And it's worse than we think it is. I was looking it up just the other day. You know, President Ronald Reagan was a great favorite in the West, and it turned out throughout America. And in one of his elections, he won by an absolute landslide. But the percentage of voting age adults who voted for Ronald Reagan that year was only 27% of voting age adults. So, you know, he won a big majority, but not of voting age adults. And of course, his opponent got even fewer votes. But it shows you that people don't register in the way they should and don't vote.
This year, it's a little different, though. We're looking at a dramatic increase in registration and participation. And we'll get to more of a discussion of that later. But still, even so, it's I think in most of these states where we've had primaries so far, it's been about 1/3 of the eligible voters have voted, and that's a big increase from other primary years.
It really is. The new people, and by that I mean younger people, who I teach some of them at the University of Montana in Missoula, and their excitement in this campaign is really extraordinary. I'm delighted, as one who's dedicated at least a fairly large portion of my life to politics, to find out that with young people who had literally dropped out, politics is cool again. And for older people, this campaign means a real significant difference in our lives. I mean, I think a lot of people are talking about it in the coffee shops and the dining room table and in the bars and around. I hear everybody talking about it. So it's made a big difference, and I think is good for America's brand of democracy.
There does seem to be a widespread sense that we're a very critical moment right now, and the choice is going to be very important. So I look forward to us getting to that. But before we do, let me just ask you personally how you first got involved. How did you decide to run for office, and what spurred you to do that?
You know, when I was in Congress during those 9 terms, which you mentioned, I would, because I'm a teacher, when I'd come back home, one of the places I'd try to go is a classroom. I'd try to go by a classroom, or sometimes I'd bring all the classes into a gymnasium. And as these kids, congressmen, and their parents, congressmen, I'd talk to them. And the question you've asked is one of the questions I used to get all the time, and that is, what got you into public life, Congressman? What made you run for Congress? And, you know, I was paid to have an answer, right? But I didn't have a good answer to that one. And finally, I just realized that it probably had more to do with the city in which I was raised than it had to do with my personal choices. That is to say, Butte was a city that liked politics, that liked politicians, that realized it made a difference to their lives. Butte wasn't separate from government. It realized government was a genuine appendage to its own city, whether it was city government, state, county, or federal. I grew up in a city where everybody read the newspaper every morning and then talked about it. And so I think my wife expressed it best. My wife is also in politics. After we came back from Washington, she surprised me by telling me that she wanted to run for the legislature. I was proud of her, and particularly proud that she's won and has done so well as the first woman elected majority leader in Montana's history, Senate Majority Leader in Helena.
Absolutely.
But you know, Carol was asked one time, Carol, why did you do this? Why are you in politics? And she thought for a minute and said, well, she said, you know, I'm from Butte, Carol too. And she said to me, and to, I think, to a lot of politicians who came out of Butte, politics is not a coat that we put on and off, to take off. And politics is our skin, and we can't take it off. And I think maybe that's a better explanation. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And why is it that that kind of engagement with politics seems to be so rare now? When did it change, and why, in your view?
Well, I don't know exactly, and although I'm a Democrat and a partisan, I don't think I'm being partisan about this. I think more the historian in me, the amateur historian, is coming out when I say that I think people's discrediting of the federal government started in the Reagan years. You know, Reagan ran against the federal government. And even when he was president, he was condemning the very government that he headed. And when it would do something wrong, quite often his fault or his administration's fault, he would condemn the government that followed his directions. He was very clever at it. Now, Ronald Reagan was a nice guy, and I liked him a lot. But I think this denigration of government started with him. And now I notice that almost every candidate that has run for president since him runs against Washington, D.C. The front runner in the Democratic primary, Barack Obama, runs against Washington, D.C. Change in Washington, D.C., change in the so-called corruption and whatever it is people think about it. It's pretty ingrained now, tragically, in the American system.
There's really a sense that there's kind of this giant federal government that's not really of the people or by the people, but we have to somehow get control of it again, it seems like.
Well, I will say this, though, and that is lobbyists do have too much control of what goes on in Washington, D.C. Money has become too important in the Congress, and maybe in politics in general, but particularly in the Congress. I tried to do the little bit about it I could. I voted for almost every campaign finance reform bill that came my way. And then I did things about it in my own office. For example, when I was elected chairman of a committee that had to deal with health care reform, I announced that I would take no campaign money from doctors, nurses, healthcare corporations, hospitals, hospital administrators. Pharmaceuticals. Nobody was allowed to give me any money. So I just wanted to remove myself from that thing about being influenced. I personally think that's, you know, if they were inclined to, that's what every member of the House and Senate ought to do when their vote, particularly if they're chairman, their vote makes, and their power makes a real difference to certain special interests. They ought to wipe those interests away.
But the problem is that at the president, that's a voluntary measure to take. I just wonder if the single thing that could change American politics more than any other would be strict public financing of elections.
Yeah, perhaps, although Americans don't seem to want that. When you poll, or at least back when I was still in Congress, it's now been, 10 or 12 years, but I saw polls about whether or not people support that, and they didn't, interestingly enough. And the Congress doesn't like to pass major legislation like that if the public doesn't support it.
Right. But Montana has one of the strictest limitations on state legislative races in the nation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Although I actually think it's too strict. You know, if you can't reduce campaign spending, but you reduce how much you can give to a candidate, $50, $25, $100, but the campaign costs $20,000, it's hard to get there. It's hard to pay your bills, in other words.
So it gives an advantage to candidates who are wealthy themselves.
And can give themselves under the Constitution as much money as they want. That's what ought to be changed. The Constitution ought to be amended to say, look, here's the short of it, Tom. The Supreme Court has found that there's an equation between money and free speech. The Constitution ought to say, no, there's no connection between money and speech. That way we could limit spending, including the wealthy on themselves.
I knew this would be so much fun. We get into all kinds of issues that we're going to have 4 half hours, I'm afraid. Well, when you were in Congress, I'm looking forward to getting back to the discussion of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, but before we do, when you were in Congress, could you mention for our viewers a few things that you think back on where your presence there made a difference and where it would have gone a different way if you hadn't been there?
Yeah. Well, I helped sponsor 2 major wilderness bills in the Congress that passed. I sponsored a lot more than that didn't pass, but the Lee Metcalf Wilderness protected a huge area north of Yellowstone Park, which is a great buffer for the park, but particularly important to animal migration patterns. After all, parks are not islands. The animals don't know when they're in or out of the park, so you need to put a little zone around it, hopefully in wilderness. I did that, and then the Great Rattlesnake Wilderness, which butts right up against this country, was my bill in the Congress. I had a bill I'm particularly proud of, which was, and it affected Native Americans a great deal, and that was, it was called the Infant and Toddlers Disability Act, and it entitled infants, newborn infants, and their parents to have a whole basket of services if that infant was disabled. And so millions of Americans have been able to get help that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Here on this reservation, if I might jump to that, Tom, in the 1980s, we had a very significant issue in front of us with regard to the Joint Board Irrigation Project. And the question was whether or not the tribes could manage that irrigation project or whether we had to continue with the then Joint Board. And the delegation, the Montana delegation, almost without exception, was either lukewarm in helping the tribe, or 2 of our 4 members in the delegation were actually opposed to helping them. Our old pal Mickey Pablo was chairman in those days, had a great tribal council, as you do today. And they came back to see me on some of them, including Mickey, on 3 occasions, explaining it to me. I talked to attorneys about it, and I came to the conclusion the tribe was absolutely right. And so I just threw myself across the tracks to help allow them to have and manage the irrigation project. The last time Mickey came to see me about this project, I said, well, I've decided whose side I'm on, Mickey. I'm on your side, and you and I are going to fight this together, and hell freezes over. And when it freezes over, Mickey, we'll skate together on the ice. And Mickey was very grateful, and I was grateful for his help. And we did manage to get that done in the Congress against all odds. I managed to bring the money for the 2 Eagle River School here. The 2 River Eagle School was on a long list, and I jumped it over other reservation schools because it was so badly needed. And so I ended up managing to get the money for that here probably 10 years before it would have come had we not had that support. And then finally, We're filming this, as your viewers know, on one of the great campuses of all tribal colleges in America. And I was really proud that when I was on the Budget Committee, I prevented the Reagan administration from slashing the budget for tribally controlled community colleges. And in fact, I helped increase the budget. And then later, I gave the tribal community colleges land grant status, which means they were available for additional pools of money. And I'm still very pleased because of the success of the tribal colleges that I was in a position to help them.
Well, we're grateful for it too.
Thank you.
And I think that's about as convincing a case as could be made for the difference that involvement in these things really does make. And we'll continue this wonderful conversation with Pat Williams in one moment. Please don't go anywhere.
In February 2009, most television stations will convert to digital transmission and no longer provide analog service. Low-power translators and Class A stations are not required to cease analog broadcasts. For more information, call 275-4878. If you watch television on cable or satellite only, you need not do anything. If you watch free over-the-air TV, you may need a converter box if your TV set is not digital. Set-top converter box coupons worth $40 toward the purchase of these devices can be requested by calling 888-388-2009 or visiting www.dtv2009.gov. When purchasing a set-top box, be sure it has analog pass-through if you intend to watch analog and digital stations. These devices are listed on the dtv2009.gov website. Call 275-4878 if you need assistance or information.
And welcome back. We're continuing our conversation today with Pat Williams in anticipation of the upcoming primary on June 3rd. Want to make sure I got that date right. And by the way, for our viewers, you can register and vote on the same day. So please, everyone, turn out for the polls on June 3rd. And Pat, before the break, we were talking about some of your years in Congress, these last 8 years have been a whole different thing, and I guess it's another example of where who gets elected really makes a difference. What's your view of the state of the nation as we approach this election, and what's happened over that time?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it, Tom? For the past any number of years, we've heard people, including people at a high level, say, you know, it really doesn't make any difference who's elected president or which party is elected. And I don't think either party should have absolute control of a majority or the presidency decade after decade. I think mixing it up is probably okay. But having said that, what we have learned when George Bush, rather than Al Gore, got elected, or at least appointed president, is it makes a great big difference. We would not have lost 4,000 of our best and brightest in Iraq. We would not be spending hundreds of millions of dollars a minute that we can't afford in this war we can't win. This war is one of the greatest mistakes and tragedies in American history. Along with that, we have an economy that's bottoming out. We have an environment that's not being tended to, and we have a growing income gap between the richest Americans and the middle income. For the first time in American history, that gap has exploded. And that's really bad news. And George Bush and 16 years of a Republican Congress are frankly to blame.
And one of the issues that I don't see getting as much attention often, but I often wonder if it's maybe going to be the more lasting damage from the last 8 years, is taking a projected surplus in the trillions of dollars and turning it into a projected deficit, or not a projected, but an actual deficit in the trust.
Yeah, $6, $7, $8 trillion deficit. When George Bush came to the Oval Office 7.5 years ago, he inherited a surplus from Bill Clinton, an annual surplus. And in 1 year, he flipped that around with bad economics. He sort of went back to the old trickle-down economics, where you make the rich richer and they're going to somehow trickle it down to the rest of us, which is one of the great nonsensical mistaken economic theories in American history. But you're right, the deficit is going to be paid, and I resent it. It's going to be paid by my little granddaughter, who's 2 years old. She's going to be paying for Bush and Republican mistakes.
Does all the blame for that change rest on Republicans, or does some of it also rest with the Democrats? I mean, I know our own senator from Montana, Max Baucus, supported that tax cut at the start of the Bush term.
Yeah, which kind of got me off of Max Baucus. To be perfectly blunt about it, I like to say what I'm thinking. And when Max Baucus supported tax cuts for the rich, because George Bush was favorably seen in those days here 6 years ago. And Max didn't want to oppose him, so he went along with it. That was a great mistake by Max Baucus, and horrible for the state he represents, Montana. And then Max also went along with the pharmaceutical industry and passed a really bad addition to the Medicare bill and a prescription drug formula. So no, Republicans are not solely to blame, but you'll notice what Max had to do in order to make those mistakes. He had to become more and more conservative and more friendly with his Republican allies. So yeah, sometimes Democrats move in a direction that's not in our best interest. And although Max has done a number of things right on the three great issues of the last few years, the war, prescription drugs, and taxes, Baucus has been wrong.
Did you find that pressure yourself when you were in Congress, between doing what you felt was right and what you felt you had to do to stay elected?
Oh, sure, and you know, one would be not telling the truth if one didn't admit that. I found myself, luckily, in sync with most of what Montanans wanted me to do. So I didn't find a lot of times when I said, well, you know, I'm not sure this is right, but most Montanans want it, so I'll do it. One of the great questions for any elected official is, are you elected to tell people no? Or are you elected to do what they want? And it is something that members of Congress spend a lot of time talking about.
Yeah, I imagine. Well, the situation that you've sketched out for us, to me, suggests that whoever's elected president in November is going to have a pretty difficult time of it.
Very difficult. It's going to be a gargantuan task to right America internationally. And by the way, I think the better candidate to do that, although I'm for Hillary, but I think the better candidate to right America internationally, at least with the non-Muslim world, is Barack Obama. And I understand why folks support him. I'm personally for Hillary for, I think, very good reasons. Then there's the economy. The next president has to right the economy, and I think Hillary would be much better at that and has to right the environment, and I think she's just better prepared to be president. But whoever is president, including John McCain, who's an old friend of mine, if John should win, he and the others have a great, big, lifting task in front of them.
No question. Well, it's incredible how fast this time goes by, but let's quickly get to why you do support Hillary.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm on the same side, but I want to hear the case.
Well, we don't have to be on the same side. Isn't that what's great about politics in America? I know both Hillary and the President Clinton, very well, and I have a deep admiration and respect for Hillary. I like Bill Clinton too, but Hillary's wiser than Bill. She's not only smarter, for a lot of proven reasons, she's a lot wiser than he is, and I think really does come to the office with significant experience. You know, for a long time there was that thing about, oh, she didn't get any experience as First Lady. Well, I'm here to tell you, as a person who worked with her for most of their 2 terms in office, Hillary Clinton did get a lot of experience as First Lady, and a lot of it was very deep, good experience. I think one of the greatest presidents in American history, speaking of First Ladies, would have been Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah. Now, times were different then. We wouldn't elect a woman. I guess times were different then, weren't they? We're going to find out.
A little bit.
Hillary's clearly behind, and I have a great deal of respect for Barack Obama, but Hillary's better, and Hillary's a lot better for Native Americans. When I worked with Hillary on health care, I chaired a committee that had to pass health care in order for it to pass the Congress. And Hillary Clinton and I talked twice a week, a minimum. In fact, I stopped in Joe McDonald's office up here to interview you, and he was talking to me about that. And I said, you know, Hillary and I talk twice a week, and about half the time, she wanted to know if the Congress had figured out a way to protect the Native Americans' health care. And she wanted the details and know how the Congress was going to do it. She had her own ideas. Hillary Clinton started the first Native American caucus in the U.S. Senate. Bill Clinton is the first president since Franklin Roosevelt to even visit an Indian reservation. I mean, they care a lot about Native American people. I think Native American people ought to be free, including the leadership, just as it has to choose either Barack or Hillary. I understand that, but I do think that Barack, because he doesn't have the experience, and we don't know what his record is with Native Americans, simply has to give speeches and make promises. As an old political watcher and an old politician, I prefer experience and production over promises. And I think Hillary has produced for Native Americans, and I know Obama has not, although he might.
When I look on their websites, I mean, you're right, it's words, but there doesn't seem to be much difference between their policy proposals, whether it's on Native Americans, on the environment, on foreign policy.
Yeah.
They're pretty close.
They really are, and there's no doubt about that, Tom. They're very close. But on the one hand, Hillary has produced on some of these things. She said need even more done to help. Obama has not been able to produce for Native Americans. Now, do I doubt that Obama would help Native Americans? No, not especially. It's just that I know Hillary would. And if there's one group in this country who should have had it up to here with promises, it's Native Americans. They ought to go with the real McCoy, in my opinion.
Well, that's a good zinger there. Well, Pat's for Hillary. I'm more for the other guy, but I'm sorry to say we're out of time because we're really just getting into this. It's been a great half hour. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Tom.
And thank you for being with us. Again, remember to get out and vote on June 3rd, no matter who you're supporting. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for our program, please email us at goodtalk@blackfoot.net. Thanks for being with us. We'll be back next week with Pat Williams for another half hour. So long.